Imagine this. A towering stranger walks into a convenience store with nothing but a backpack. The clerk smirks, throws out rude remarks, and dismisses him like he's a nobody. But what happens next will leave you speechless, because this nobody turns out to be one of the most legendary figures in the world. What's in that backpack? Why is he really here? And how does this life-changing moment turn the clerk's world upside down? Stay tuned. This is a story you won't believe. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The door jingled as a tall man entered, carrying a black backpack over his shoulder. His size alone turned heads, but he moved quietly, scanning the aisles like any other customer. He wore a simple hoodie and sneakers, blending in, though his calm demeanor carried an unspoken weight. He picked up a bottle of water and walked toward the counter. Behind the register, Charlie glanced up, his face already twisting into a smirk. Mid-30s, tired and always eager for a distraction, Charlie thrived on snide remarks to break the monotony of his shift. His gaze lingered on the man's backpack. "What's in the bag?" Charlie quipped, barely masking his sarcasm. "Carrying snacks for your friends?" The man didn't bite. He placed the bottle on the counter, his calm expression unchanging. "Just water," he replied, his voice low and steady. Charlie rang up the water with deliberate slowness, his smirk growing. "Backpack like that? Thought you might have something more exciting in there. Maybe you're headed to art class?" He chuckled, glancing at another customer nearby, seeking validation for his joke. The man remained quiet, handing over a bill and waiting for his change. There was no anger in his eyes, just a calm, deliberate presence that made Charlie falter for a moment. Then, without a word, the man slipped his change into his pocket, tucked the water into his backpack, and walked out, the door jingling softly behind him. A young boy nearby tugged on his mother's arm, whispering, "Mom, I think that's him, isn't it?" His mother gave the man a brief glance and shook her head. "Don't be silly. He's just some guy." But the boy kept staring at the man as he walked away. Charlie leaned on the counter, watching through the window, muttering to himself, "Some people really think there's something, huh?" But his eyes lingered on the man longer than he intended, something about the interaction sticking with him in a way he couldn't explain. Charlie leaned back in his chair, still glancing out the window as the man disappeared down the sidewalk. The quiet buzz of the store returned, but his thoughts lingered on the odd interaction. The guy didn't even flinch, just stared back like he had nothing to prove. That kind of calm rubbed Charlie the wrong way. It always did. "Hey, Charlie," Rachel called from the stockroom as she pushed a cart of new inventory toward the front. Younger and far friendlier, Rachel had a way of smoothing over Charlie's rough edges. She noticed his distracted look and smirked. "Let me guess, some customer got under your skin again?" Charlie scoffed, rolling his eyes. "More like some guy thinking he's better than everyone else because he's, 6 feet tall, and carrying around that stupid backpack like he's heading to camp." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Wait, tall guy, backpack, you mean the one who was just here?" "Yeah, him. What about it?" Charlie folded his arms, annoyed at her sudden interest. Rachel glanced toward the door as if expecting to see the man again. "You didn't recognize him?" she asked, lowering her voice. Charlie let out a short laugh. "Should I have? What, is he the mayor or something?" Rachel shook her head, clearly unimpressed. "No, Charlie, think bigger." He frowned. "Bigger?" "Yeah, like basketball player big. I swear he looked familiar. It's like I've seen him before. Maybe in a commercial or—" "Please," Charlie interrupted, brushing her off with a wave of his hand. "If he was famous, he wouldn't be shopping here for bottled water. Come on, Rachel, use your brain." Rachel didn't press the point, but her curiosity didn't fade. She returned to stocking shelves, occasionally glancing at the door, while Charlie muttered under his breath about people acting like celebrities when they're probably nobody. Meanwhile, outside, the young boy from earlier still lingered with his mother, his gaze fixed on the direction the man had gone. "Mom," he said again, this time more insistent, "I'm telling you that was him. The guy on TV. I know it." His mother sighed. pulling him gently toward their car. "That's enough, Tommy. Let it go." But Tommy didn't let it go. As they climbed into the car, he turned to look through the rear window, catching one last glimpse of the man walking away, his backpack slung over his shoulder like it was the most normal thing in the world. Tommy wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment meant something. Inside the store, Rachel's phone buzzed on the counter. As she glanced at the notification, her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered, scrolling quickly. She turned to Charlie, her voice filled with urgency. "Charlie, I think I know who he is." Charlie barely looked up from his magazine. "Oh yeah? Let me guess, he's the president's bodyguard or something." Rachel ignored the jab, holding up her phone to show him a photo. It was a news article featuring a familiar face, towering over a group of kids, his unmistakable grin lighting up the picture. "That's him," she said firmly. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." Charlie's smirk faded for the first time that evening as he stared at the screen, his stomach twisting slightly. "No way," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You've got to be kidding me." But deep down, he knew she wasn't. Charlie stared at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he studied the picture. The man in the photo was unmistakable. The same towering frame, the same relaxed demeanor, even the same easy smile. There was no doubt about it. The guy who had walked into his store casually carrying that backpack was Shaquille O'Neal. "No way," Charlie repeated, though his voice wavered. He grabbed Rachel's phone to get a closer look, scrolling through the article. It detailed Shaq's recent charity efforts, highlighting his visits to small communities to fund school programs and surprise local businesses with support. The headline read, "Shaquille O'Neal, the giant with a giant heart." Rachel crossed her arms, watching him. "Still think he's nobody?" she asked, a hint of smugness in her tone. Charlie didn't answer. His mind raced, replaying every interaction he'd just had with the man. The backpack, the calm stare, the complete lack of reaction to his snide remarks. It all made sense now. A sour feeling settled in his gut, but he pushed it aside. "Well, if he's such a big deal, what's he doing in this dump?" he muttered, trying to mask his unease. "Maybe he's here for something important," Rachel said. "Did you see what was in his backpack? Maybe it's for one of his charities." Charlie scoffed, though less confidently this time. "Yeah, right. Like someone like him would come here just to hand out free stuff." Rachel shrugged, but her curiosity only deepened. She glanced toward the door again, half expecting Shaq to walk back in. "You didn't even notice him, Charlie. You're so busy judging people that you don't even pay attention." "Don't start," Charlie snapped, feeling the sting of her words. "He didn't exactly introduce himself." Rachel smirked. "He didn't have to. Anyone paying attention would have recognized him. Even that little kid outside figured it out before you." Charlie opened his mouth to retort, but the door jingled, cutting him off. Both he and Rachel turned toward the entrance, their hearts skipping a beat. A small group of people entered, chatting among themselves, their excitement palpable. One of them, a young man, glanced around the store with wide eyes. "Did he leave already?" the young man asked, walking up to the counter. "Shaq? I heard he was here." Charlie froze, unsure how to respond. Rachel stepped in, her voice calm but curious. "You just missed him. Why? Were you looking for him?" The young man nodded eagerly. "Yeah, my friend texted me. Said he saw him outside helping someone with their groceries. I can't believe I missed him. He's been doing this tour, you know, popping up in random towns, giving back to communities. It's all over social media." Rachel's eyes widened, and she quickly pulled out her phone to search for updates. Sure enough, videos and posts were beginning to surface, with people sharing stories of Shaq's surprise visits across the region. The hashtag #Shaq Surprises was trending, filled with photos and clips of him at small businesses, schools, and local events. Charlie's stomach churned as he watched Rachel scroll. He could feel the weight of his earlier behavior pressing down on him. For the first time, he didn't have a sarcastic remark ready. He felt embarrassed, maybe even ashamed. As the group of customers left, still buzzing with excitement, Rachel looked over at Charlie. "You really blew it, you know," she said, her tone softer now. "You had a chance to meet him, and instead you made him the butt of your jokes." Charlie's face hardened, his defenses kicking in. "It's not like he cared. He probably hears worse every day." Rachel shook her head. "That's not the point. He didn't have to care. You should have known better." Charlie didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed a rag and began wiping the counter, his movements quick and tense. But Rachel wasn't done. She leaned in, her voice firm but kind. "You can't treat people like that, Charlie. Famous or not, you never know who someone is, or what they've done, until you take the time to notice." Her words lingered in the air as Charlie kept scrubbing the counter, his jaw clenched. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a faint cheer rose, as if the town itself was coming alive with excitement. Rachel stepped back, giving Charlie space. But as she returned to her stocking, she couldn't help but wonder, if Shaq was still in town, what else might he have planned? And would Charlie find a way to make things right? The store quieted down as the last of the group left, leaving Charlie and Rachel alone again. Charlie busied himself with the counter, but his movements were slower now, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Shaq's calm expression, the way he had carried himself without a hint of arrogance. It gnawed at him, the realization that he might have been out of line. Still, his pride refused to let him admit it. At least, not yet. Rachel, meanwhile, had stopped stocking shelves. She was glued to her phone, scrolling through videos and posts under the trending hashtag. "Look at this," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. She held up her phone, showing Charlie a video of Shaq helping an elderly woman carry a heavy box to her car. The caption read, "Shaq surprises again. The biggest guy with the biggest heart." Charlie glanced at the video briefly, then returned to his task. "Yeah, great. So he's a nice guy. What do you want me to do about it? Send him a thank you card?" Rachel sighed, lowering her phone. "You're impossible, you know that? This isn't about what you do for him, it's about what you do for yourself. You acted like a jerk, and now you've got a chance to fix it." "Fix what?" Charlie shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "I didn't hurt the guy's feelings. He's Shaquille O'Neal, for crying out loud. He's got everything, money, fame, respect. What does he care about what some clerk in a convenience store thinks?" Rachel stared at him, her expression calm but firm. "It's not about him, Charlie, it's about you. You treated someone like they didn't matter, and now you know there's someone important. But here's the thing. He mattered before you knew who he was. Everyone does." Charlie blinked, caught off guard by her words. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of a car horn outside stopped him. Both he and Rachel turned toward the window. There, parked just outside, was a sleek black SUV. And stepping out of it, just as casually as before, was Shaquille O'Neal. Charlie froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Rachel was already moving, rushing to the door to see what was happening. Shaq didn't look toward the store at first. Instead, he headed to the trunk of the SUV and began pulling out large bags filled with what looked like supplies. A small group of people started to gather, murmuring in excitement as they recognized him. Rachel opened the door, letting in the cool evening air and the faint buzz of voices outside. "Charlie," she said, glancing back at him, "you might want to come out here." Charlie hesitated. He felt rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to stay behind the counter to avoid the situation entirely. But another part, the quieter, nagging part, told him he couldn't hide forever. After a moment, he sighed heavily and followed Rachel outside. The crowd had grown, and Shaq was now surrounded by people thanking him and asking for pictures. He smiled warmly, taking the time to greet each person. In his hands, he held a backpack. Not the same one he'd had earlier, but a larger one stuffed with items he was handing out to kids and families. Rachel nudged Charlie. "Go on," she whispered. "Say something." Charlie swallowed hard. He could feel the heat rising in his face as he took a tentative step forward. Shaq spotted him almost immediately, his gaze calm and steady, just as it had been earlier. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Shaq's mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. "Hey," Shaq said, his voice as deep and steady as ever. "Back again?" Charlie shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Yeah, looks like you are too," he said, his attempt at humor falling flat. Shaq didn't respond right away. He handed a bag to a young girl before turning back to Charlie, his expression patient. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Charlie glanced at Rachel, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he looked back at Shaq. "Listen," he began, his voice low and uneven. "About earlier, I think I might have been out of line. I didn't know who you were, and I shouldn't have treated you like that, so I'm sorry." The crowd around them quieted slightly, a few people watching the exchange. Shaq studied Charlie for a moment, then nodded. "Appreciate that," he said simply. "But you know, it's not about who I am, it's about how you treat people, period." Charlie nodded, the weight of Shaq's words sinking in. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I get that now." Shaq smiled again, clapping Charlie lightly on the shoulder. "Good," he said. Then, with a gesture toward the bags in his SUV, he added, "You want to help me out? Got plenty to go around." Charlie blinked, caught off guard by the offer. But before he could overthink it, Rachel nudged him forward again. "Go on," she said with a grin. "You've got a lot to make up for." For the first time in a long time, Charlie smiled, small and tentative, but genuine. "All right," he said, stepping toward the SUV. "What do you need me to do?" Shaq handed him a bag and nodded toward the waiting crowd. "Start with them," he said. As Charlie turned to hand out the first bag, he couldn't help but feel a shift within himself, a quiet but undeniable sense of change. For once, he wasn't the one handing out judgment, and that felt surprisingly good. Charlie worked quietly, handing out bags to the growing crowd. Each bag was filled with essentials, food items, school supplies, and small toys for kids. With every smile and thank you he received, something inside him softened. It was strange, this feeling of actually doing something good, something bigger than himself. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't just going through the motions. Shaq moved with ease among the people, crouching down to talk to kids, shaking hands, and laughing with parents. His presence was magnetic but humble, and Charlie couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed genuinely drawn to him. There was no pretense, no ego, just a guy trying to make a difference. It was a stark contrast to Charlie's earlier assumptions. Rachel stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a wide smile. Occasionally, she'd snap a photo or video, unable to resist capturing the moment. She caught Charlie's eye and gave him a thumbs up, mouthing, "You're doing great." Charlie rolled his eyes but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. After about 20 minutes, most of the bags had been distributed, and the crowd began to thin out. A few kids lingered, chatting excitedly about their new toys, while parents thanked Shaq one last time before heading off. Charlie found himself standing near Shaq, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. "You do this often?" Charlie asked, his tone casual but genuinely curious. Shaq turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said. "I try to anyway. Got lucky in life, you know. So I figure, why not give back?" Charlie nodded, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people being so straightforward about their generosity. "Must feel good," he said after a moment. "Seeing all these people happy." Shaq smiled, his gaze shifting to a little boy running off with a new basketball tucked under his arm. "It's not about how it feels for me," he said. "It's about what it does for them. Sometimes the smallest thing can change someone's day or their whole life." Charlie let that sink in, the weight of Shaq's words hitting harder than he expected. He thought about his own life, about all the bitterness and frustration he carried around. Maybe, just maybe, there was a different way to be. As the last of the families left, Shaq turned back to the SUV and began packing up the empty bags. Rachel stepped forward, her face glowing with admiration. "That was amazing," she said. "You're amazing." Shaq chuckled. "Nah, I'm just a guy with a little extra to give. That's all." Rachel wasn't having it. "Don't be modest, you didn't have to do any of this, but you did. That says a lot about you." Shaq glanced at Charlie, who was fidgeting with his hands, unsure whether to join the conversation or stay quiet. "Everyone's got something to give," Shaq said, looking directly at Charlie. "Time, kindness, respect. Doesn't have to be big. It just has to matter." Charlie shifted uncomfortably under Shaq's gaze. He wasn't used to people looking at him like that, like he was capable of more than he believed himself to be. "Guess I've got some catching up to do, huh?" he said, attempting a half joke. Shaq smiled. "It's not about where you start. It's about where you go from here." For the first time that night, Charlie felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, just a quiet flicker deep in his chest. But it was enough. Rachel's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. "Shaq, looks like word's getting out. People are posting videos from here. I think the whole town knows you're here now." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I'd better wrap up before this turns into a full-blown event." Rachel looked disappointed. "You're leaving already?" "Not yet," Shaq said. "Got one more stop to make, but I'll be back around." He glanced at Charlie again, his tone lighter now. "And next time I expect better service at the counter." Charlie laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even himself. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll work on that." Shaq nodded, slinging his new backpack over his shoulder. As he climbed into the SUV, he gave one last wave to Charlie and Rachel. "Take care, you two. And remember, small things, big difference." As the SUV pulled away, Rachel turned to Charlie, her grin stretching from ear to ear. "So," she said, folding her arms, "how does it feel to have been schooled by Shaquille O'Neal?" Charlie smirked, shaking his head. "Pretty humbling, I guess." Rachel nudged him playfully. "Think you'll stick with it? The whole being nice thing?" Charlie paused, his gaze drifting to the now empty parking lot. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I just might." The store felt quieter than usual after Shaq's departure, as if his presence had left an energy behind that was now missing. Charlie lingered near the counter, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the glass door. For years, his job had felt like a trap, something he did because he had no other choice. But now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning how much of that was true, and how much of it was just him refusing to try. Rachel was still smiling as she locked up the stockroom. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "he wasn't just talking to the crowd out there. He was talking to you, too." Charlie didn't respond right away. He ran his hand over the counter, wiping away an invisible speck of dust. "Yeah, I got that," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. Rachel leaned on the counter across from him, studying his face. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Charlie let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "What do you want me to do? Start handing out free stuff to everyone who walks in?" Rachel rolled her eyes. "It's not about that, Charlie. It's about the way you treat people. You act like you're stuck here, like this job is some kind of punishment, but that's on you. You've got the power to make it better, or at least make yourself better." Her words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Charlie had spent so much of his life blaming the world for his problems that it hadn't occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely at fault. Before he could respond, the door jingled again, and a young boy stepped inside with his mom. It was the same boy from earlier, the one who had been convinced that Shaq was in the store. He looked around eagerly, his face falling when he realized Shaq wasn't there. "See?" his mom said, nudging him gently. "I told you, honey. He's not here anymore." The boy's shoulders slumped, but Charlie surprised himself by speaking up. "Hey, kid," he said, stepping out from behind the counter. "What's your name?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide. "Tommy," he said hesitantly. Charlie crouched slightly to meet Tommy's gaze. Well, Tommy, I'll let you in on a little secret. You were right. That was Shaquille O'Neal in here earlier. Tommy's eyes lit up. Really? I knew it. Yep, Charlie said, glancing at the empty shelves where Shaq's supplies had been stacked. And you know what? He left something behind for kids like you. Charlie walked to a display rack, grabbed a basketball from the sports section, and handed it to Tommy. It wasn't anything fancy, just a regular store-brand basketball. But the look on Tommy's face made it feel like a treasure. Are you serious? Tommy asked, clutching the ball to his chest. Charlie nodded. Absolutely. Shaq would have wanted you to have it. Tommy turned to his mom, his face glowing with excitement. Can I keep it, Mom? Please. His mom hesitated, glancing at Charlie. How much is it? Charlie shook his head. It's on the house, he said, his voice steady. Consider it a gift. Tommy's mom looked at him in surprise, her expression softening. Thank you, she said quietly. That's very kind of you. As they left the store, Tommy bouncing the ball with every step, Charlie felt an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest. It wasn't the same as when he won an argument or got the last word. This feeling was quieter, deeper, something that felt like pride, but better. Rachel was grinning at him when he turned back toward the counter. Well, look at that, she said, folding her arms. The Grinch's heart grew 3 sizes tonight. Don't push it, Charlie muttered, though he couldn't keep the smile off his face. Rachel laughed, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. Good night, Charlie, she said as she left. Try not to scare off any more basketball legends, okay? Charlie chuckled softly, watching her go. As the door swung shut, he glanced around the store. It was just a convenience store, nothing special. But maybe it didn't have to be special for him to start making it better. For the first time in years, Charlie didn't dread the next day. Instead, he found himself looking forward to it, wondering how he could do things differently, how he could be different. And somewhere, deep down, he silently thanked Shaquille O'Neal for showing up with his backpack and reminding him of something he'd long forgotten. It's never too late to start again. The next morning, the store had a quiet hum as Charlie unlocked the doors, flicked on the lights, and began his usual routine. But something felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the air seemed lighter, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel weighed down by the thought of another long shift. He glanced at the counter and paused. The basketball rack, now 1 ball short thanks to Tommy, caught his eye. The memory of the boy's glowing face as he hugged the ball to his chest made Charlie smile. For a moment, he replayed the words Shaq had said. It's not about where you start, it's about where you go from here. With that thought in mind, Charlie grabbed a notepad from under the counter and began scribbling a list. It wasn't anything grand, just small ideas to brighten the store. A new help-yourself coffee station, maybe a community board where locals could post about events, or even a little corner for kids with a few toys and books. Nothing fancy, just things that could make the place feel more welcoming. Rachel walked in about an hour later, her eyebrows raising as she spotted Charlie tinkering with the shelves near the entrance. He was rearranging snacks and adding a sign that read, "Grab a snack, stay a while." Okay, who are you, and what have you done with Charlie? Rachel teased, hanging up her jacket as she made her way to the counter. Charlie didn't look up, but the corner of his mouth twitched in a faint smile. Just trying something new, he said simply, stepping back to admire his work. Rachel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You're really taking this to heart, huh? All that small things, big different stuff? Charlie shrugged, though his movements lacked their usual edge. It got me thinking, he admitted. If someone like Shaq can take time out of his life to help strangers, what's stopping me from doing the same? I mean, it's not like I'm changing the world, but maybe I can change this little corner of it. Rachel's expression softened, her usual teasing tone replaced with genuine warmth. You know what? I think that's pretty awesome, Charlie. Before Charlie could respond, the door jingled and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Tommy and his mom, the boy clutching the basketball he'd gotten the night before. His face lit up when he saw Charlie. Hey! Tommy called out, running up to the counter. "I've been practicing with the ball, look." He dribbled it a few times, his movements clumsy but enthusiastic. Charlie grinned, leaning on the counter. "Nice moves, kid. Keep at it, and you'll be dunking in no time." Tommy beamed, but his mom stepped forward, her face tinged with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said softly. It might not seem like a big deal, but it meant a lot to him, to both of us. Charlie nodded, his voice quieter now. "It's no problem, really." As they left, Tommy waving enthusiastically over his shoulder, Charlie felt that same quiet warmth from the night before. He didn't need a thank you. Just seeing the boys' excitement was enough. Rachel, who had been watching the exchange, gave Charlie a knowing look. "All right, who are you, and what have you done with the old Charlie?" He chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe the old Charlie needed a break. The rest of the day passed with the usual rhythm of customers and small talk, but every interaction felt just a little different. Charlie made an effort to smile, to ask how people were doing, to see them as more than just transactions. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that evening, as he was cleaning up, Charlie's phone buzzed with a notification. Curious, he glanced at the screen and saw Rachel had sent him a link. It was another video of Shaq, this time from a neighboring town, handing out supplies at a school. The caption read, "Shaq's message. It's not what you have, it's what you give." Charlie watched the video, a small smile tugging at his lips. As the clip ended, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen for a moment longer. "Not a bad way to live," he muttered to himself, closing the phone and getting back to work. Though the store felt the same as it always had, Charlie couldn't help but feel like something new had begun, not just for the store but for himself. The following week brought subtle but noticeable changes to the store. Charlie's list of ideas had slowly started coming to life. The Help Yourself coffee station was set up near the entrance, and a small sign beside it read, "Take a cup, share a smile." On the opposite wall, a new bulletin board hung, already pinned with a few flyers, local events, lost pets, and even a handwritten note offering free tutoring for kids. Charlie had even added a small basket of colorful stress balls and mini puzzles near the counter, marked with another sign, "For the little ones, take one." Rachel couldn't stop smiling as she watched him work. She still teased him mercilessly, of course. "You're going soft on us, Charlie." But deep down, she was proud of him. The customers had noticed the difference too. The regulars who once avoided Charlie's sharp comments now lingered longer, chatting with him about their days. Even newcomers felt welcomed, often complimenting the changes with a quick, "This place feels nicer than I remember." But not everything had shifted completely. Late one afternoon, just as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows through the store's windows, a man entered. He was tall, wiry, and looked slightly disheveled. His hoodie pulled tight over his face. He moved quickly through the aisles, grabbing a few small items and keeping his head down. Charlie, watching from the counter, felt his old instincts kick in. Something about the man's hurried movements and the way he avoided eye contact sent a red flag through Charlie's mind. His hand hovered over the intercom button, ready to call Rachel to the front for backup. The man approached the counter, placing a handful of items down: a bottle of water, a pack of gum, and a bag of chips. His hoodie remained up, shadowing his face, and his hand trembled slightly as he pulled out a crumpled bill. Charlie studied him, his earlier judgment tugging at him, but then Shaq's words echoed in his mind. "It's about how you treat people, period." He paused, inhaling deeply to steady himself. "Hey," Charlie said, his tone softer than usual. "You all right, man?" The man flinched slightly, clearly not expecting the question. He glanced up briefly, just enough for Charlie to see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Just rough day, that's all." Charlie nodded, scanning the items without comment. "Rough days happen," he said lightly, handing back the change. "If you need anything else, let me know." The man froze for a moment, as if surprised by the lack of confrontation. He mumbled a quiet thanks and left quickly, the door jingling softly behind him. Rachel, who had been watching from the stockroom, stepped out once he was gone. "You good?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Charlie nodded, though his expression was thoughtful. "Yeah, I'm good," he said. He glanced back toward the door, his mind replaying the interaction. "I just didn't want to jump to conclusions. Who knows what that guy's going through?" Rachel gave him a small smile. "Looks like someone's been paying attention." Charlie chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't start." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the moment stayed with Charlie. For so long he'd seen people as problems to be dealt with, obstacles to endure. But now he realized every person had a story, and while he might never know all the details, he could at least meet them with kindness. It didn't cost him anything, and who knew? It might even make their day a little easier. As he locked up the store that night, Charlie stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. The town was quiet, the streetlights casting soft halos over the empty sidewalks. He glanced back at the store, now subtly transformed with its little touches of warmth and community. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt different, better. Pulling his jacket tighter against the evening chill, Charlie started walking home. His steps were slow, unhurried, and for once he didn't feel weighed down by the day. In fact, he felt lighter, almost hopeful. As he turned the corner, the faint echo of laughter reached his ears. A family playing in their yard, their voices carrying through the crisp night. He smiled to himself, a small but genuine smile, and kept walking. For the first time in years, Charlie didn't just feel like he was going somewhere. He felt like he was moving forward. The next day brought an unexpected surge of customers. Word had spread about the little changes in the store, and curious locals trickled in, some just to check it out, others to chat about the coffee station or the community board. Charlie found himself busier than usual, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he welcomed the energy. It was a refreshing change from the slow, monotonous days he used to dread. Mid-morning, a middle-aged woman walked in, holding her phone in one hand and her young daughter's hand in the other. She scanned the store, her eyes lighting up when she spotted Charlie behind the counter. "You're the guy, aren't you?" she asked, approaching him with a bright smile. Charlie blinked, confused. The guy for what?" The woman laughed, showing him her phone. On the screen was a social media post, a photo of Shaq handing out supplies outside the store, with Charlie faintly visible in the background, awkwardly holding a bag. The caption read, "Even the clerk joined in to help Shaq give back. Love seeing the community come together." Charlie groaned inwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Oh, that," he muttered. "I wouldn't say I was a big part of it." "Don't be modest," the woman said warmly. "My neighbor said her kids got some things from that night and it made a huge difference for them. It's good to see people stepping up." Charlie wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised, especially not for something like this. He glanced over at Rachel, who was smirking at him from the stockroom door. "You're famous now," she mouthed, clearly enjoying his discomfort. The woman continued, her tone more serious now. "You know, it's little things like that that remind people there's good in the world. You probably don't realize it, but what you're doing here matters." Her words hung in the air long after she left. Charlie found himself turning them over in his mind, wondering if they were true. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make a difference. For years he'd dismissed the idea entirely, convinced that nothing he did could ever really matter. But now he wasn't so sure. That afternoon, a man in a business suit walked in holding a large cardboard box. He approached the counter and set it down with a grin. "I heard about what you guys are doing here," he said. "Figured I'd pitch in." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" The man opened the box to reveal stacks of notebooks, pencils, and art supplies. "I run a stationery store downtown," he explained. "Thought maybe you could use these for the community board, or I don't know, however you're helping out." Charlie stared at the box, momentarily at a loss for words. "Wow," he finally said. That's really generous. The man shrugged. Hey, it's good for the community. And if Shaq thought your store was worth stopping by, I figure it's worth supporting. Rachel, who had come up to the counter to see what was going on, nudged Charlie with her elbow. Looks like your reputation's catching up with you, she teased. Charlie shot her a look but couldn't hide the small smile on his face. Thanks, he said to the man, his voice quieter now. Really, this means a lot. As the day went on, more people came in with small donations. Canned goods, toys, even handmade cards for the bulletin board. Charlie and Rachel worked together to organize everything, turning the store into a hub of activity and connection. For the first time, Charlie felt like the store was more than just a job. It was becoming something real, something meaningful. Late that evening, as Charlie was sweeping the floor, Rachel leaned against the counter, watching him with a thoughtful expression. You know, she said, you could have just let that night with Shaq be a one-time thing, but you didn't. You actually ran with it. Charlie paused, leaning on the broom handle. I don't know, he said honestly. I guess I didn't want to go back to the way things were. Feels good to actually do something, you know? Rachel nodded, smiling. Yeah, I do. As they finished up for the night, Charlie found himself looking at the store differently. It wasn't just a place to clock in and out anymore. It was becoming a part of something bigger, a small but growing spark in the community. And for the first time, Charlie allowed himself to feel proud, not just of the store, but of himself. The next morning, the energy in the store felt more vibrant than ever. The bulletin board was filling up with handwritten notes, event flyers, and even a small poster announcing a local basketball clinic, courtesy of a nearby gym inspired by Shaq's visit. Charlie couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction every time someone stopped to pin something up or grab a coffee from the new station. As the day went on, Rachel came up with another idea. You know what this place needs? She said, leaning over the counter. A donation jar, something simple. People could pitch in a little extra and we can use it to help out more. Charlie considered it for a moment, then nodded. That's not a bad idea. But we'll make it clear where the money's going. People don't like handing over cash if they don't know what it's for. Rachel grinned. Look at you, Mr. Thoughtful. I'll find a jar and whip up a sign. Within an hour, a clear jar sat at the counter with a hand-lettered note taped to it. Community Care Fund, help us help others. The first customer to notice was an older woman who had been coming to the store for years. She dropped a few coins in the jar with a smile. This is a good thing you're doing, she said, nodding at Charlie. You've got a big heart. Charlie flushed slightly, not used to the compliments, but he muttered a quick, thanks, and went back to ringing up her groceries. Still, her words stayed with him. By lunchtime, the jar already had a handful of bills and coins, and Charlie couldn't help but notice how people seemed more cheerful as they contributed. It was a small gesture, but it gave them a chance to feel part of something bigger, and that was what mattered. Mid-afternoon, the familiar jingle of the doorbell brought in a man Charlie hadn't seen in years. He was older, his face weathered, and his clothes suggested hard times. Charlie blinked in surprise as recognition dawned. It was Bill, a man who used to work at the store before Charlie had taken over the counter job. Back then, Bill had been a bit of a mentor, gruff but kind, always willing to share a story or offer advice. Bill, Charlie said, stepping out from behind the counter. Is that you? Bill smiled faintly, his eyes tired but warm. Hey, kid, he said, his voice as gravelly as ever. Figured I'd stop by, see if this place still stands. Looks like it's changed a bit. Charlie hesitated for a moment, then extended a hand, which Bill shook firmly. Yeah, we've been making some changes, Charlie said, motioning around the store. Trying to do something more, you know? Bill's gaze swept the store, taking in the bulletin board, the donation jar, and the cheerful hum of activity. Looks like you're doing all right for yourself, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. Didn't think I'd ever see this place with so much life in it. Charlie chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. It's a work in progress, he admitted. But, thanks. That means a lot coming from you. Bill nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. Without a word, he dropped them into the donation jar. "Figure I can pitch in," he said simply. "I know what it's like to need a little help." Charlie's chest tightened at the gesture, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he clapped Bill on the shoulder. "Thanks, Bill. That means a lot." The two of them chatted for a while, reminiscing about old times. Rachel eventually joined in, laughing at some of Bill's stories about a younger, more hot-headed Charlie. By the time Bill left, Charlie felt a strange sense of closure, like a piece of his past had come back to remind him how far he'd come. As the day wound down, the donation jar continued to fill, and the store felt more alive than ever. Charlie leaned against the counter, watching as a few kids pinned up a handmade flyer for a lemonade stand they were hosting. He smiled, thinking about how much the place had changed in such a short time. Rachel came up beside him, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee. "So," she said, nudging him lightly, "what's next? You going to turn this place into a full-blown community center?" Charlie laughed. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, but I don't know. Feels good to see people coming together like this." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it does. And you're the reason it's happening, Charlie. You started this." Charlie didn't respond right away. He watched as the kids finished pinning their flyer, then ran out the door, their laughter echoing behind them. He thought about Shaq, about the ripple effect of one small moment of kindness. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "But it's not just me. It's everyone. That's what makes it work." Rachel smiled, clinking her coffee cup lightly against the counter. "Still," she said, "you're doing all right, Charlie." For once, Charlie didn't deflect. He simply smiled back. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." A few days later, the store saw another unexpected surprise. The day had started like any other, steady but unremarkable, when a shiny black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Charlie, sweeping near the front door, glanced up and froze as the vehicle door opened. Out stepped Shaquille O'Neal, his presence as towering and unassuming as ever. Rachel, who had been restocking candy near the register, gasped audibly. "No way," she whispered, dropping the box she was holding and rushing to the counter. "Charlie, he's back." Charlie stood rooted to the spot, his broom in hand and his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was more excited or nervous. Shaq walked toward the door, carrying his signature backpack and wearing a broad, easy smile. The moment he entered, the usual hum of the store seemed to pause. "Hey, my man," Shaq greeted, his deep voice filling the room. "How's it going?" Charlie finally snapped out of his stupor, setting the broom aside and stepping forward. "Shaq," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Didn't think we'd see you again." Shaq chuckled, glancing around the store. His eyes lingered on the coffee station, the community board, and the donation jar. "Looks like you've been busy," he said, his smile widening. "I like what you've done with the place." Charlie rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a rare twinge of pride. "Just trying to follow your advice," he said. "Small things, big difference, right?" Shaq nodded, clearly pleased. "That's what I like to hear." He glanced over at Rachel, who was grinning from ear to ear. "And you must be the one keeping this guy in check." Rachel laughed, nodding. "Someone's got to do it." Shaq set his backpack down on the counter and unzipped it. "Well, since you've been putting in the work, I figured I'd bring you something to keep it going." He pulled out several items, a stack of basketballs, a few jerseys, and a signed poster. "Thought these might help with that community board or any events you're doing." Charlie stared at the items, his breath catching in his throat. "Shaq," he said, his voice quieter now. This is incredible. You didn't have to do this." Shaq shrugged, his expression kind but matter-of-fact. "It's not about what I have to do," he said. "It's about what I can do. And I can see you're trying to make a difference here. That's what matters." Rachel stepped forward, picking up one of the jerseys and holding it up with awe. "This is amazing," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "The kids around here are going to lose their minds." Shaq leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on Charlie. "So," he said, his tone light but pointed. "How's the attitude adjustment going? Treating people right?" Charlie chuckled, a little embarrassed but genuinely happy. "I'm working on it," he admitted. "I still have my moments, but yeah, things are better. I feel better." Shaq gave him an approving nod. "That's what I like to hear. Keep it up." A few customers began trickling in, and it didn't take long for them to notice Shaq. Excited whispers spread through the store, and within minutes a small crowd had gathered. Shaq, ever patient, took time to greet each person, take photos, and share a laugh or two. Charlie watched the scene unfold, feeling an odd sense of contentment. He wasn't just the guy behind the counter anymore. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. As the crowd thinned, Shaq turned back to Charlie and Rachel. "You've got something good going here," he said. "Don't stop. And remember, kindness spreads. You never know who you're helping." Charlie nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thanks, Shaq," he said, "for everything." Shaq smiled, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Anytime, my man. Keep it real." With that, he gave one last wave and walked out the door, leaving behind a store that felt brighter, fuller, and more alive than ever. Charlie and Rachel stood in silence for a moment, watching him go. "You know," Rachel said finally, breaking the quiet, "you might actually turn out to be a decent guy after all." Charlie laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head." Rachel smirked, nudging him. Too late. As the door jingled with the arrival of another customer, Charlie turned back to the counter, a small but genuine smile on his face. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready to meet it head-on. The days that followed Shaq's second visit brought an unmistakable buzz to the store and the community. The signed basketballs and jerseys were proudly displayed on the new community corner, surrounded by thank you notes from local kids and families. The donation jar filled faster than Charlie and Rachel had anticipated, with people dropping in spare change and even larger bills. It wasn't just a store anymore. It was becoming a hub, a place where people gathered, shared, and connected. Charlie, once known for his gruff demeanor, found himself at the center of it all. Customers who used to avoid his sarcastic remarks now lingered to chat with him, sharing stories about their families or plans for the weekend. He listened, really listened, and found that he actually enjoyed hearing about their lives. It was a far cry from the man he'd been just a few weeks ago. One afternoon, a group of kids burst into the store, chattering excitedly. Tommy was among them, his basketball tucked under his arm. He ran up to Charlie, beaming. "We're putting together a team," he announced, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "A team?" Charlie asked, leaning on the counter. "For what?" "Basketball," Tommy said, bouncing the ball for emphasis. "Me and my friends. We're gonna practice after school, and we want to play in tournaments. We just need somewhere to practice." Rachel, who had been stacking shelves nearby, perked up. "That's a great idea," she said. "You could use the school gym, right?" Tommy's smile faltered. "They said it's already booked most of the time, and the park courts aren't great. There's cracks everywhere." Charlie frowned, thinking. He glanced over at the signed basketballs and jerseys, then back at Tommy. "What if we find you a better spot?" he said. "There's gotta be somewhere in town you can use." Tommy's eyes lit up. "You'd help us?" Charlie nodded. "Sure, why not? We'll figure something out." Rachel grinned at him, clearly impressed. "Look at you, community hero," she teased. Charlie rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his smile. "Don't push it," he said, ruffling Tommy's hair. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning. Charlie and Rachel reached out to local businesses and the town council, pitching the idea of fixing up one of the old community centers with a proper basketball court. To Charlie's surprise, people were eager to help. Donations poured in, not just money, but materials, volunteers, and offers of support. As the plans came together, Charlie couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. For years, he had seen the world through a lens of cynicism and frustration, convinced that nothing he did mattered. But now he realized how wrong he'd been. One small moment, a decision to be kind instead of dismissive, had sparked a chain reaction, creating something far bigger than himself. The turning point came on a bright Saturday morning. The community center renovations were complete, and the town gathered for the grand reopening. A gleaming new basketball court awaited the kids, with fresh paint, new hoops, and plenty of space to play. The energy in the air was electric as families arrived, many of them bringing food, drinks, and lawn chairs to celebrate. Charlie stood near the entrance watching as kids ran onto the court, their laughter echoing across the lot. Tommy was among them, leading his group of friends in an impromptu game. The sight filled Charlie with a quiet pride that he hadn't felt in years. Rachel appeared beside him holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Charlie, her smile warm. "So," she said, "how does it feel to be part of something bigger?" Charlie took a sip of his coffee, his gaze still on the kids. "Feels pretty good," he admitted. "Better than I thought it would." Rachel nudged him playfully. "Better than complaining about customers all day?" Charlie laughed. "By a long shot." As the event continued, Charlie noticed Shaq's SUV pull up. The man himself stepped out, greeted by cheers and applause. He walked over to Charlie and Rachel, his grin as wide as ever. "You guys really pulled it off," Shaq said, looking around the transformed center. "This is incredible." Charlie shrugged, though his smile betrayed his pride. "Just followed your lead," he said. "Small things, big difference, right?" Shaq nodded, clapping Charlie on the shoulder. "You took the ball and ran with it, man. That's what matters." For the rest of the day, the celebration continued, filled with games, food, and laughter. Shaq even joined the kids for a quick pickup game, much to their delight. Charlie and Rachel watched from the sidelines, soaking it all in. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the court, Charlie realized something important. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a passive observer just going through the motions. He was part of something meaningful, something good. And that, he knew, was worth more than anything he could have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, the celebration at the community center began to wind down. Families gathered their belongings, kids reluctantly left the basketball court, and the sound of laughter gave way to the soft murmur of goodbyes and thank yous. Charlie stood near the court, leaning on a railing, watching as the last of the kids left with wide smiles and promises to return the next day. Shaq approached him, his massive frame silhouetted against the warm evening light. He was carrying his backpack, now almost as iconic to Charlie as the man himself. Without a word, Shaq handed Charlie a crisp, autographed basketball. "For you," Shaq said, his voice calm but purposeful. "Not for the store, for you." Charlie stared at the ball for a moment, his throat tightening. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, taking it carefully. It felt heavier than he expected, not just in weight but in meaning. Shaq smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just remember what you did here. And keep doing it." Charlie looked down at the ball, then back at Shaq. "I didn't think I had this in me," he said quietly. "All this, I didn't think it was something I could be part of." Shaq placed a hand on Charlie's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "The only thing stopping you was you," he said. "You're not just part of it, man. You're the reason it happened." The words hit Charlie harder than he expected, and for a moment he was grateful for the fading light. It hid the emotion flickering across his face. He nodded, unable to speak, but Shaq seemed to understand. Rachel joined them, holding her phone. "All right," she said with a grin. "I need a picture of this moment. The legend and the unlikely hero." Shaq chuckled. "Unlikely hero, huh? I like that." Charlie groaned. "Do we have to?" "Yes," Rachel and Shaq said in unison, leaving no room for argument. Rachel snapped the picture. Shaq towering over Charlie, his arms slung over the smaller man's shoulders, both of them holding up the autographed basketball. Charlie tried to scowl for the photo, but his grin betrayed him, lighting up his face in a way Rachel hadn't seen before. Afterward, as Shaq prepared to leave, he gave Rachel a fist bump and nodded at Charlie one last time. "You guys keep this going," he said, "and don't let me hear about you slipping back into old habits, Charlie." Charlie laughed. "No promises," he joked. But there was a sincerity in his tone that didn't go unnoticed. As the SUV pulled away and the crowd fully dispersed, Charlie and Rachel stayed behind to clean up. The night was cool, and the stars were starting to peek through the sky. The new court, now empty, still felt alive with the energy of the day. "You're gonna miss him, aren't you?" Rachel asked, stacking a few chairs. Charlie shrugged, setting the signed basketball on the bench beside him. "Yeah," he admitted, "but he's not the reason all this happened, not really." Rachel smiled, leaning on a stack of chairs. "Look at you, all wise and introspective. Who even are you anymore?" Charlie smirked. "Don't get used to it." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the events of the day settling in like a warm blanket. When they finally finished and locked up the community center, Charlie lingered for a moment, staring at the court one last time. "You know," Rachel said as they walked toward their cars, "you should keep that basketball somewhere you'll see it every day. A reminder." Charlie nodded. "Yeah, I think I will." As he drove home that night, the signed basketball sat in the passenger seat, glinting faintly in the light of the passing street lamps. Charlie glanced at it every now and then, a small, satisfied smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready to embrace it, to keep moving forward, one small thing at a time. And as he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, Charlie sat there for a moment, staring up at the stars. He thought about Shaq, about the kids, about all the little changes that had added up to something so much bigger than himself. Then, with a deep breath and a quiet sense of pride, he picked up the basketball, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. He had no doubt that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but he was ready for them. Because now he knew the truth. It wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up, trying, and making a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. The story of Charlie and the small convenience store transformed by one man's kindness is a powerful reminder of how even the smallest gestures can create ripples of change. Charlie, who once saw the world through cynicism and doubt, discovered that the key to happiness wasn't about what he lacked, but about what he could give. Shaquille O'Neal's visit was more than a celebrity encounter. It was a spark, igniting a transformation in not just a store, but an entire community. Charlie learned that kindness isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up, treating people with respect, and believing that everyone has something to offer. The lesson here is simple but profound. No matter where you are or what you do, you have the power to make a difference. Charlie's journey proves that it's never too late to change, to care, and to contribute to something bigger than yourself. Small actions can lead to monumental change, and sometimes all it takes is a single moment to set that in motion. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more heartwarming tales, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how you're making a difference in your own way. Let's keep spreading kindness together.